Joining me today for the Meiji Masters podcast is Professor Ger Graus, OBE, who is an iconic, and I'm going to insert maverick figure in the field of education. He's a renowned expert on education, innovation, and community engagement, and he was the first global director of education at the world famous children's entertainment education company called Kidzania, as well as the founding CEO of the Children's University. Professor Ger, thank you very much indeed for joining me today for this podcast. Really appreciate it. Before we dive into sort of specific questions, you have an absolutely fascinating background in education. I've never met anyone quite like you who's got this background in what you've done. So could you, for our listeners, just explain how you got to do what you're currently doing?
Thank you, Stefano, and it's brilliant to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Real pleasure.
I think backstories are really important. I think backstories are probably more important than we think, and I don't think we spend enough time on people's backstories. So I was many moons ago. I was born in the Netherlands, in the south of the Netherlands, at a time when there was full employment. It was kind of in the post-war rebuild of the country, and the south was the industrial heartland in terms of coal mining, etc. So there was a sense of pride. There were communities, and everybody in that sense was relatively happy, despite the dangers of the employment, and people were reasonably well off. And in a sense, that's probably reminiscent of many other parts of Europe, including the UK. And so I grew up into that world, and it was also a world, with hindsight, that was perhaps not as aspirational for its young people as it might have been, because you just do what everybody else has always done and you'll be all right. So I went to school. I was quite bright. I did quite well. I was bored. I was a bit naughty. And then on the one, I was probably the only pupil in that Catholic school to actually get banned from religious education lessons for a while.
Right.
That's for another time, probably. And then one day I got this new German teacher. I was pretty good at languages, my favorite subject. I grew up in an area, of course, if we look where Maastricht is,
Right.
It's 4 miles from the Belgian border and 6 miles from the German border.
So you're multilingual.
Yeah, so you grew up with that. I mean,
Okay.
so, television was it was accessible. Belgian television in French, German television, Dutch television, which also had English. So my first English really came through Coronation Street and subtitles, and I sounded like Hilda Ogden or a younger version thereof. But so languages was kind of my favorite subject. And then I got this newly qualified teacher, Mr. Burskens, who was quite amazing. And I became a German teacher because of him. And he was the kind of guy who was more than a teacher, because after the very first lesson, halfway through the first lesson, he said to me, "I'd like to see you at the end of the lesson." And I thought, well, here we go again.
In trouble.
So yeah. So I kind of walked up to him, hands in pockets, and kind of went, "What?" at the end of the lesson. And he went into his briefcase and he got out a book, the collected short stories of Heinrich Böll, and he said, "I think you're really good. I think you should read." I took the book home, I read it that night, and like Oliver Twist, I went back the next day and said, "Can I have some more?" And he said to me, "Keep that one," and I've still got that book.
Wow.
And then he gave me Draußen vor der Tür by Wolfgang Borchert. He also was the person who went to see my parents and persuaded my parents that I should go and study at university. It was not...
If I may ask, more or less, how old are you at this stage?
I'm kind of 18.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was not the done thing that people went to university, because you went back into that community. You should be going down the coal mines. Why would you leave here? Why would you do those things? But with his help, I went to university, became a German teacher, spent quite a lot of time abroad as part of my studies in what was East Germany and also West Germany and Austria, and then became a German teacher. And then there was no requirement, in a sense, or no need in the Netherlands at the time for teachers because the terms and conditions were good. And so I then tootled to a library on a Saturday morning, came across the Times Educational Supplement and saw a job advertised in Norwich in England, 1 year only, teacher of German. And so I applied. And I thought, well, rather than go on the dole or whatever, I'll just make the most of what I've done. And I travelled. And I arrived in Norwich in September 1983 with my suitcase.
Right.
And 1 year has become, I don't know how many it is now, 35 plus, because life happens. And I became a German teacher. And Mr. Burskens, my German teacher, who's still alive, and I am in touch with him still. So I owe him that. And that kind of taught me many things for the rest of my life in terms of role models and how important other people can be to children. Not in terms of what they teach, but kind of how they are as people. And so I became a German teacher. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I organized. And then this odd thing happened in Norwich and in a sense in England, because for the first time I was confronted with children, brilliant young people, who didn't quite know why they were learning this language, because the mantra was, everybody speaks English anyway. So I set up school links and work experience and all sorts of things for 14 and 15-year-olds and then younger ones, so that they could find their purpose. And from there, I loved the school. It was a small school. It was a new school. It had a brilliant head teacher who looked after her people. And I moved from a school of 500 in the whole school to a school of 500 in a year group. And that school was in the north east of England, in Hull, and that was a marked difference. And you learn lessons, I think, as you go along. And
So a couple of quick questions, if I may. So would you say your German teacher back in the Netherlands, was he your first, in inverted commas, mentor? Would you say was he the first guy in your life, other than your mum and dad, who maybe gave you that sense of direction?
Kind of consciously, yes. I mean, there was always my granddad, who was still my hero, and he was my coal miner granddad. And that conversation, you've got certain memories in your life. If you close your eyes, they're there, aren't they? And so I was 9 years old. I was sitting with him outside their front door, which is brown. He was wearing his cap, and he was sitting on a blue kitchen chair. And if I close my eyes, I can feel the sun on my face. And he was the coal miner with arthritis and bad lungs, as so many were. And he said to me, promise me you will always do your best at school. He didn't say, promise me you'll get A stars, but promise me you'll always do your best at school. And of course, being 9, you go, why? And his answer was, because I don't want you to have hands like mine. And that kind of sticks. And that's a story that's still, wherever I speak in the world, that story is still there. The influence that our immediate relatives at a very young age have on us, the seeds they plant, and how they lead by example, because most of our behavior in early years is kind of copied behavior. It is subconsciously, these people become our role models. We want to be like them.
And I know we'll come on to talk about this, but I mean, really, I'm getting the sense of feeling the importance of having positive role models in your young life, because without those, I'm assuming it's a bit like a ship without a rudder almost.
I think we may well come on to that. I think if you look at youngsters in certain circumstances, in certain contexts, who haven't got those role models, I think there's a gap then.
Okay.
So I moved from this small school to this big school, and the small school in Norwich was in a reasonably affluent area. Okay. The big school in Hull was in a disadvantaged area.
Right.
And the lesson taught was that big schools are not good for most children.
Why?
Because you don't know them.
Right.
And the difference is, good schools are more than a school. Good teachers are more than a teacher.
Okay.
And you can only exercise that if you know your youngsters.
Right.
And the youngsters in disadvantaged area, perhaps more than others, need an arm putting around them, need to find that role model relationship. And my lesson there became, and it sticks with me, is that I firmly believe that in this country and in many others, when we talk about education policy and educational decisions, that's not true. Most education policies and most education decisions are made for economic reasons. And when I ask people why big schools are good, the answer far too often is economies of scale. I don't care about economies of scale. I care about the kids. So you pick those lessons up, and then I was part of the National Curriculum Working Group for the introduction of modern languages, and I then became languages advisor in the city of Manchester.
For the whole city of Manchester.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
And introduced primary languages into all the primary schools. We set up links with schools in Italy and France and Germany.
Wow.
and the Soviet Union at the time.
And was that difficult to implement?
No, it was really easy because this organisation called the European Union
Right.
encouraged this through a number of programs, from Lingua to Socrates and Comenius, whatever they became, and effectively we applied for and were given money to train our teachers to teach those languages.
Okay, so just to keep us in broad thing of the timeline.
Yeah.
So where are we now?
So
we're about
1991, 1992.
And you're in charge of languages throughout the whole of the city of Manchester.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Wow. What an
So that was cool, and then so what happens is your reputation kind of builds, I suppose. And I was then at my boss,
right,
David Johnson, who was then Deputy Chief Education Officer in Manchester, became Chief Education Officer in Salford, and invited me to go with him.
Right.
And I moved from one northwest city to another. Right? Although, of course, the people of Salford will always remind the people of Manchester that they were a city first.
Right.
And effectively, what then happened is that there's this period then in my working life. I then became an inspector. I joined the dark side for a while.
Okay.
I became a Darth Vader.
Right.
And learned from that, because I think that's what we need to do, and learn from that inspecting is like taking Polaroid photographs.
Right.
All you do is you show an image at that moment in time. It doesn't make it any better.
So it's a real snapshot.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
And actually, why do we inspect schools is an interesting question, I think. And why do we inspect? And I think in the first instance, organisations like Ofsted in England were set up because governments didn't trust schools and didn't trust teachers. And that's a very odd thing. And I think that persists to this day and is a big issue. So I then came out of this phase and became Anakin Skywalker again.
Right.
And was asked by the then government under Tony Blair was invited to become the director of education in what were known as education action zones. And I had two. They were in South Manchester, in an area called Wythenshawe, now also known as Marcus Rashford Land, because that's where he was born. Adjacent to Manchester Airport. And you had this, and so the government had identified initially 25 areas in the country, in England, that were most in need of educational support because they were the most disadvantaged areas. So the gap was biggest. And it was done with support of the private sector. So I had an office in Manchester Airport, and my chairman at the time was the brilliant Jeff Muirhead, who was then the chief executive of Manchester Airport Group.
So who would have been the education secretary at the time?
That at the time was David Blunkett, and then going into Estelle Morris.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
And I think we both share an affinity.
That we do indeed for Estelle. Yeah, great lady.
Love her.
Incredible.
And what happened was those organisations, the Education Action Zones, were given a licence to do things differently.
Right.
And the reason is that we still do to this day in our schooling and in our education, we live this thing about more of the same will make a difference. It's kind of Einstein's definition of insanity. You keep doing the same thing, but you expect
the different results.
So your maths result aren't very good. So what we do is we're going to give you more maths. You can come in on a Saturday morning now.
Right.
I mean, that really will turn people on. And so we were given a license to do things differently, and brought, with the help of Manchester Airport and other companies, we brought in what I would describe as purpose. Because when I talked to lots of those youngsters, little ones, and you said, tell me why you go to school, the answer was because I have to. And historically, and in their communities and their context, quite often those youngsters grew up in an area of historical unemployment. So in terms of their communities, their parents, their grandparents, perhaps even, the value of going to school had been lost. Well, it did nothing for me. Why would I do something for you? And we needed that back. And we worked with pilots from British Airways and all sorts of people to
try and inspire them?
Well, actually, to kind of go, why? So, you talk to a pilot and the youngster says, oh, God, I want to become a pilot. And the pilot says, well, if you don't do those things at school, I didn't like them either very much, but without them, I wouldn't be here. Right. So you begin to understand why, you answer why questions.
Right.
And the whole thing made a difference. And the other thing that we were able to do, connected to the Sure Start program that had been introduced, in a sense, community support for young parents and young children.
Right.
We connected to that. So we build from the bottom, because that's the other weird thing we do, I think, in schooling. I'll come to the difference between schooling and education in a minute. In schooling is, if you build a house, right, you start with a foundation.
That's right.
And the better your foundation is, the higher you can build.
Yeah,
right?
and more stable.
Yeah. And you grow a tree by watering the roots and feeding the roots.
That's right.
In schooling, we put most money and most resources into the children the closer they get to their examinations. So a 15-year-old is worth a lot more than a 5-year-old. That's just short-termism.
So you're saying it's an upside-down pyramid?
Yeah, it's totally nonsense because actually, yes, you might get your test results, teach and test.
Right. And
you're schooling children, but I'm not quite sure how well you're educating them. So I think that needs to come from the bottom.
So can you give an example, like what, for example? So what should be being done differently then?
So that thing about at early ages, look at some of the work that goes on in Italy, in Reggio Emilia,
right.
The wonderful Fondazione Reggio Children there, where they work with communities and parents and young children in all sorts of environments to allow, not to allow is the wrong word, to enable and empower the children to play and learn. Right? So, and that takes time. So why do we start sending them to school and expect them to be able to read and write at the age of 5? Yeah, the best education systems, whatever that word best means, allow children to develop in behavioral terms, in terms of allowing them to fall over and learn how to get up, to explore, to become more independent, to be inquisitive, to be curious, to enjoy that. And the focus, I think, in my view, in education needs to be on creating a joy of learning and building scaffoldings around each child so that they can achieve their potential.
So you're saying, but the emphasis needs to be much more on the foundation.
Yes.
So may I ask you a question? And I mean, this may be a painfully stupid question. How do you know what you're saying is correct?
There's very clear evidence, and I'm always, I'm very not nervous, but I'm very conscious of using words like, phrases like world beating and best, right? Because I think what's best for the child is what matters, not what's best for the system. But there's very clear evidence that if you look at countries like Finland and other Scandinavian countries, you look at in part what goes on in Canada, and you certainly look at what goes on in northern Italy, in Reggio Emilia, and you look at the development of those children. And then at the very long-term view, when those children become adults, they are better learners. They become better equipped citizens for a world that is rapidly changing in all sorts of ways. But they also educate the whole child. And there are ample evaluations from very eminent universities that will back that up. We in our country are now in danger of not educating the whole child, but we are schooling the child in subjects.
So essentially, if I've understood you correctly, you're saying we're basically training children to pass exams.
Yes, we are.
In a nutshell.
Test and teach without any sense of purpose, We never allowed a child, because there isn't time, because they're precious, we never allowed a child to explore why certain things are done. So the system, really simply put, is the following.
Right. Okay.
So you have the government of whichever persuasion.
Okay.
You have a government at the top, and the government with the help of civil servants who often have never been in a school and sit in offices.
Okay.
They design what the children should be taught, and they call that the national curriculum. Then it falls on schools to deliver what the government wants the children
So
to
they
be
have
taught.
to implement the strategy.
Yes.
Right.
And the teachers in the school have to do that. Now, how do you make sure that they deliver this? You make sure by publishing test results, examination results, and by inspecting the schools and sticking labels on them like outstanding or failing.
So, Professor, let me ask you a very painfully stupid question now that may come across really silly, but is it still the case? Are you saying this was the case 25 years ago? And it's still the case
I think it's worse.
So a silly question. Why is it, for example, the government of whatever persuasion, how come they're not consulting with someone like yourself or headmasters or headmistresses who have spent a lifetime in education and saying, guys, this is what we think we should do. What do you think? Are you saying that doesn't go on?
Not enough. I think it's a very interesting thing, and I think all parties are guilty of that, although I would argue some more than others.
Okay.
They consult with professionals of their choosing.
Like-minded people. So they're an echo chamber.
Well, they're not going to choose people who are going to vehemently disagree with them. Yeah? But here is a very simple question.
Okay.
Right? So I take two children.
Okay.
And this is not a judgment question. This is simply an observation. I take two children. One child is growing up in an affluent-ish area with parents who both have jobs.
And take an interest in their education.
They have their own room, they have their own laptop, they have an internet connection, they have their own mobile phone. The parents support them, take them places, do all those things. Yeah?
Okay.
Brilliant. Then here I have a child who grows up in a very disadvantaged area.
Okay.
Equally loved by their parents, by the way, because sometimes we confuse those things. Equally loved by their parents, but those parents haven't got their own education background, don't earn much money, aren't very confident, and those children then struggle and haven't had the experience of going to a museum, going on holidays, being here, there, and everywhere, going to restaurants.
Okay.
Then those children go to school.
Okay.
And when those children's schools are inspected and those children are tested, they are treated the same. Now, somebody needs to convince me, they've been trying for a long time, somebody needs to convince me that that is right and that that is fair and that that is good for the country and whatever goes with it. The child from the more disadvantaged context doesn't need any favours doing. They just need more scaffolding. The expectation should still be high. The aspirations should still be high. Yeah? But it is, the progress rate will be slightly slower and it needs to take pace. Whereas
But they can still get...
Yes. If we as adults support this, let me tell you a story about Wythenshawe.
Sure.
So when I worked in Wythenshawe at Manchester Airport, I loved it. Marcus Rashford, incidentally, at the time was at Button Lane Primary School when I was director there. So I take absolutely all the credit.
All the credit. Yeah.
Not for his footballing skills, but for being a brilliant person.
Okay.
Right? So when I spent, the reason Manchester Airport, one of the reasons Manchester Airport was involved in this whole scheme was they had an aim long-term, they took a long-term view of wanting to recruit people locally. Why? Because it's good for the business, right? It just makes total sense. So they were heavily invested in it. Apart from that, there were some brilliant people in there at the top who had a big picture and a good vision. So I spend a lot of time talking to children and to families. And I used to go into primary schools because I never understand why we talk to 14-year-olds about their careers. It's 14 years too late, you know? So I used to go into primary schools and talk to 6 and 7-year-olds. And I used to ask the question, tell me the jobs you can do at Manchester Airport. And the answer you got were the things they could see, which I estimate that you could only see about 55% of the jobs in an airport, and 45% are backstage.
Okay.
Yeah. So instantly, in terms of aspirations, you are ruling out 45% because they've never seen them. And that is a duty of the airport to come out and explain to people more what's out there.
Okay.
Right? Now, that's the first point. Then the second point was, once they'd given me the jobs selling newspapers and W.H. Smiths and this, that, and the other, I used to say to the kids, you can fly planes. You can see that you can fly planes. And I used to get an answer from 6 and 7-year-olds regularly that was, people from here don't fly planes. So when people come to me and say children lack ambition, I will categorically say that that's not true. We do that for them. Somebody somewhere repeatedly has uttered phrases like, people like us don't do that.
You really believe that's what it is?
Yes. Yeah.
And you're saying,
Yes.
would you say that's happening at the home?
Yes.
And is the converse true?
And I think, I'm sad to say, it will also happen in some schools because children in bottom sets don't become pilots.
Right.
I know this is a stark kind of example, but my point is this, that in order to educate the child, it's often said that it takes a village to educate a child. I think we also need to be mindful that at the same time as educating the child, we need to co-educate part of that village as well. And we need, and that's in, my wife's a teacher in the north of England in a school in a challenging area, and her mantra is that every child is everyone's responsibility. So I think we need to readdress all of this, yeah? And we can get there, but the comparison between the child from Wythenshawe and the child from Kensington and Chelsea, I'll just use them as an example. It is not fair, it is not right, and it is unhelpful. Yeah. So the schools, then you begin to compare schools and you begin to say, that's an outstanding school, and that's not an outstanding school, but you're comparing apples with pears.
Okay, so but let me ask you this: what do you think is the primary role of schools?
The primary role of schools is to be, I'll use a football analogy.
Okay.
This is my right.
Okay.
So the primary purpose of schools is to be more than a school, and this applies particularly to primary schools. And I think in many ways this was backed up during the pandemic.
Okay.
So if we purely see a school as the institution that passes on knowledge and no more, close it down. We'll save ourselves a fortune. Put everybody on the internet, teach them how to use it.
Learn remotely.
Easy.
Yeah.
But what we know, and what we particularly know from the pandemic, since the pandemic, is that the personal matters. Yeah? And that we as institutions, schools as institutions at the heart of communities, are able to enable and empower children to become learners and better citizens.
Long term.
Long term. And I think that's an important thing. And let's just get that straight. Right? We are in a country that has a two-party system. And I think that's very unfortunate. That's a personal view. But I think it's very important, because very, very unfortunate, because in a two-party system, it is very difficult to get consensus. Because what happens is you get elected after an X number of years, and you have to be seen to be different and to undo most of what has been done. So actually your progress is something like 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Right.
And also, we only ever plan on a 4 or 5 year cycle. So your children could be under 3 or 4 different governments during their schooling time. And they could literally be both a yo-yo and a political football. And that is just unhelpful. So we need to begin a public debate, led no doubt by the politicians, a cross-party approach to say, well, what is it we actually want from this? What is it? Do we just want them to test results? Do we want to be top of the PISA league tables, the international league tables in terms of who does best in tests? Or do we want to create a society where people feel that they have a responsibility and a duty as well as rights and can do as well as they possibly can.
Okay, so Professor, let me ask you a couple of questions now. That's burning in the back of my mind, listening to what you're saying. I have family members who have been primary school teachers in deprived areas, and I know one of them, in fact both of them, used to say to me, they used to struggle teaching the subject. And the reason they struggled teaching the subject is because so many of the children were very, very sadly came from families. They weren't being nourished properly. They didn't come in with clothing and all that type of stuff. And it's incredibly sad. And they and they were doing more work on pastoral care than they were actually trying to teach a subject. So how if you were advising the government today, I mean, how does one deal with that if you're a school? How do you deal with children who are coming tragically from such disadvantaged children, such disadvantaged families? How do you address that?
Well, firstly, it takes me back to the whole consensus, and we need a public debate, right? Now, firstly, whatever people's views are, some people will say the parents should do more, they should work harder, they should get jobs, it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault, and it's their fault. It's never the child's fault, first and foremost, right? So whoever people want to point the finger at, they cannot point the finger at the child. Yeah. Then we do have to then raise that question about why are they going to school? Because if it is purely about the knowledge, then the answer to your question will be very different. I think it's about much more than that. And so in terms of your family members, if a child, Magic Breakfast springs to mind. Lucy and John Richardson are behind this. It's a charity. If a child comes to school hungry,
they're never going to learn, are they?
If you're hungry in the morning, how good are you at your job?
You're not. I mean, it's just impossible. Yeah.
So then I can hear it say, but the parents should make sure that they're fed.
Right.
Well, they don't, or they're not, for whatever reason. Yeah. Talk about that some other time.
Right.
So do we then say, well, because the parents don't, we let the child go hungry? So when I was talking earlier about building the scaffolding around the children, and the scaffolding is to enable them to become the best learners they can be.
Okay.
And that may well be about breakfast, that may be about washing their clothes, that may be about going somewhere to buy them shoes because they haven't got any, or they've got holes in them. That may be about providing rooms that are warm for them. That's to a degree the world we live in. Now, we can ignore that and say we're not going to do that. Then we as a society have to live with those consequences. Or we try our best to help. And why should the schools do that on their own? There are loads of people out there who can come and give us a hand with this and create environments where those children can learn. This is not about giving and then, they'll take it. This is about a very long-term view, which I will say was started under David Blunkett and particularly Estelle Morris in the whole Sure Start thing, because that was essentially a preschooling movement to try
to build the foundations you're talking about.
And if you look at a school like my wife's school, she has a deliberate policy to employ as many local people and parents as they can into roles connected to the school. It makes it more of a community school. It means that people are earning money, they've got jobs, they can pay for their heating bills and food for their children. We have to create this because it's never the child's fault. So your family members are right. That's the situation, but we have to do something about this. And there again, I think we need to look as part of a bigger debate. Well, should schools in more challenging areas not automatically be given more money? I know they get pupil premium funding, but additional funding, community, yes, about community funding,
right?
Yeah, to make that better, because we also still live in that daft scenario that schools in London are the children in schools in London are awarded or carry more money, much more money than, and I'll beat the drum for the North, than the kids in Manchester or in Sheffield.
Is that actually correct?
Actually, you can.
Right.
And I'm not talking about.
I never knew that.
I'm not talking about a couple of pennies. So, so the achievements of the schools in London are remarkable, but they're partly remarkable because they got lots more money, And actually, the differential in terms of costs of running a school in Sheffield and running a school in London, there is a differential. It's more expensive in London, but not that much.
Right.
So I know schools in from my time in Wythenshawe, if they'd had that per pupil funding,
Right. You would have had a different set of
Yes.
results.
yes,
Okay, so let me ask you something else. We always often hear about superheads who go in,
Yeah.
a bit like you do in commerce. You always hear about, an incredible CEO who goes in
Yeah.
and turns a business around. So you must have come across a number of superheads
Yeah.
who go into challenging environments, and I'm not talking about private schools
Yeah,
who've got loads of cash. So what are the attributes of the superheads that they're able to work with the same level of resource, but kind of change the culture of that school and get sort of really different results? What are the attributes that they have?
I'm going to be slightly controversial now. I think I said earlier that many education decisions are not education decisions; they're decisions that are economic decisions and about economies of scale. So it is undoubtedly true that the creation of a superhead, one head for 2 or 3 schools, that it may save money. It's an economy of scale.
Right.
It may be that there is a shortage of people. I'm not a great believer that that model works. I'm an absolute believer in superb heads
Right.
who serve their communities, who know their children, who are there every day, who lead not just the school, but the community and everything that's connected with it,
Right.
with a vision and with a passion. I absolutely believe in that. What I also know is that you can't just take that model from this context and plant it somewhere else.
Right.
So I think there needs to be a model where schools work together more closely. And I don't mean like the academy trusts, whereby, because again, that's an economic model.
Right.
That was a political game under the current government to replace, to disempower local authorities.
Right.
Yeah, because the academy thinks under the previous Labour government started as there were a small number of schools that were at the point of the last chance saloon.
Right.
So you treated them differently, right? So, but anyway, so I do believe, of course, heads should work together, learn from each other, but as good practitioners, they do that anyway. Right. So this idea of a super head, Alex Ferguson didn't run 2 football clubs.
Right.
Right? And I'm not quite sure that he would have done it that well either.
Right.
Right? And you, as an entrepreneur and businessman, you don't run several businesses that are distinct. Remember, they are distinctly different. They're distinctly different communities. So what the superhead, in a sense, becomes is I suppose what we've seen in the academization in recent years is you create a CEO,
Right.
yeah, who is then so far removed from the children that you have to begin to ask questions, because teaching is a weird profession, right? Because the better you are at being a classroom teacher,
Right.
the more chance you get of being promoted,
And that takes you further away from
which
children.
takes you away what you were brilliant at in the first place. So that's a bit like saying to the best chef in your restaurant,
Right. Go and
I'm
sit
not-
in an office.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. So we've even got that bit wrong, I think.
Right.
And I would make a big plea. I'm here because of my German teacher,
Right.
right? I stood at a conference. It was probably professionally the greatest moment in my life. I stood at a conference I was speaking at a conference in Kuala Lumpur, and I was just checking out the room, and the previous speaker was in the room, was checking out the room, what it sounded like and whatever. It was a huge event.
Right.
And this previous speaker stops his speech and says, ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to know I'm here because of that man at the back. And it was a guy called James Neal, who was then the international director for GL Education.
Wow.
A very big company.
Wow.
He was one of my kids at Taylor High School.
Wow.
So that's what teaching should be about, I think. And I think, I've felt this for a long time. When you're a doctor, a medical doctor, you're held in high esteem, never high enough, right? But you're held in high esteem for who you are, what you do, yeah? And they say DR, Stefano, Dr. Stefano.
I wish, yeah.
I think we should come to the point where we have a TR for teacher.
You don't think teachers are held in high enough
No,
esteem?
I think it's scandal. I think the government doesn't trust them. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Ofsted. I think parents' attitudes towards teachers is often appalling and disrespectful. I think the pandemic changed that for a little while when people kind of all of a sudden.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, why is that? Is that just a historical? Like, why is that?
I think
is that a historical thing?
No, well, I think it's something that's developed or has been allowed to develop over time. And I think sometimes, this isn't straightforward on one side. Sometimes I think the teaching professions and their representations haven't necessarily helped themselves. Yeah. But there is a thing about, and I often think this in the best possible way, the problem with education, with schooling, is that everybody's been to school. So therefore, everybody's got an opinion.
And everyone knows what's best, presumably.
But nobody's the expert. Right? Because they all have opinions, all parents have opinions. But if you actually turn around and, in the old-fashioned sense, go, here's the chalk, there are 30 kids.
Yeah, go
off your tootle.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I think, and once, I did this once, and it was quite a good thing. I was proud of it afterwards. Every summer, you get people telling you that the exams are getting easier and the kids are not as bright as they were last year. So I kind of get fed up with it because I think it's incredibly disrespectful. I cannot do my daughter's homework. I can in some subjects, but when the maths and the science comes home,
you couldn't do it.
I go and hide, right?
Okay.
So what I did, you're around friends and you're in a bar or in a pub. This is some years ago, and I got fed up with it. So I brought in on this Sunday afternoon some GCSE maths papers, and they were off again. It was kind of August time. Oh, it's not the way it was on an hour day and all that stuff. So I went, here we go. Off you go. You've got an hour.
Right.
And all of a sudden, there were all sorts of reasons why they had to go home.
Right.
So I think that there is this wonderful quote in a book called The Little Prince, which is, all grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it. I think we would do well to hang on to that quote. And actually, we should show teachers the respect they deserve. And I think there's a particular issue sometimes in the independent sector on this, because when people pay to send their children to school, there is a risk that an attitude develops that therefore they either own the place or that they've absolved themselves from the responsibility.
Right.
Parents are co-educators. Children are in school 192 days per year, 9 to 4. If you do the maths, they are at home with the parents.
So it's a 50-50, really.
Yes, and the parents and teachers need to support each other. They both have an interest in that child. So why not work together? And schools are often not welcoming, and they've got big fences, and they've got these horrible telephone systems that go press 99 to speak to their head teacher or whatever it is. We need to just look at those things as well and kind of go, here is the child, right? And I think this is a picture I use quite often. So if you throw a pebble into a pond, at the point of the pebble being the child, right? Not that I advocate throwing children in ponds, but you throw the pebble in the pond, and the rings are created.
Right.
Each ring is connected to that pebble, however far out it goes, right? As a teacher and as a parent, I'm pretty much close to the point of contact. But we don't behave like this. So there needs to be this cooperation. And I think sometimes we live in a society whereby we're so preoccupied with seeking who to blame. We're certain it removes us further from the solution. If there is something about the learning or about the well-being or about the behavior of a child, we need to sit down, we need to work out who's going to do which bit, and we need to rebuild the scaffolding around that child. 99.999% of parents love their children. And from my experience, 99.999% of teachers love their children in the sense that they want them to do as well as possible. So at the moment, we've got these two parties running, I think, too parallel. And I think there is a great call to see parents as co-educators. And I sometimes call on primary schools and say, can you set a family homework? Not maths, right? But watch 20 minutes of David Attenborough if you're talking about climate change or nature, whatever. And just sit down for a little while and encourage that working together. And technology, incidentally, is not the answer. The answer will always be human relationships.
Okay, so let me ask you a few quick-fired questions as we're coming almost kind of veering towards the end of our discussion. But a few quick-fire questions. If you're a parent and you're choosing a school for your child, a primary school, or indeed even maybe a secondary school, how should the parent just be looking at, dare I say, Ofsted reports or so? What would you say is the benchmark for a parent? And sometimes some parents don't have a choice; they have to send the school. But what would you say the parent, if you're a parent and your child's entering higher education, what would you say the parent should be looking at a school to determine whether it's good or not so good? What would you say?
Of course, you should look at the data. Of course, you should look at Ofsted reports, and of course, you should look at test and examination results. But only as part of a very big picture. The test and examination results show you some comparison for what they're worth. Ofsted reports, we have to always remember, are written to a framework. So when a school is classed as outstanding, they are actually outstandingly compliant with the Ofsted framework.
Okay.
Yeah, they've ticked all the boxes really well. They don't make them brilliant, it just makes them outstandingly compliant to the framework. My view is very simple. I say it to young people who apply for their first teaching job, and I'd say it to parents. Ask to go around the school, but not on an organised evening. Yeah,
just sort of almost ad hoc.
Make an appointment and ask the head teacher or the deputy, whoever it is in the school. Can I just walk around? Oh, right. Yeah, and if you want, and can I have a pupil to show me around? And then remember that all grown-ups were once children. Yeah, and only a few of them remember it. And I think from that, because in the end, what do we want our children? We want them to be successful academically, as successful as possible. But we want them to be happy. We want them to enjoy going. And if I look at my now 17-year-old, she goes to school, and there are very few days when she goes to school not with a smile on her face. And there are very few days when she doesn't come home.
Would you say that's the real kernel of success then, that the child is happy to go to school?
Yes, she wants to go.
Right.
And if you want to go, if you look at it like a football match, if the exam, for what it's worth, is the match, yeah, you have to go to training every day, and you have to be tested and tried, and you have to be seen to be laughing with your mates. Her happiest day in 2020 was when she could go back to school and not be taught online. She wanted interaction with her teacher.
So she missed the community.
Yes, so that nonsense about schools will disappear. I think one thing the pandemic proved is it will not disappear. Where the parents also have an important role to play, and that kind of also ends my going back to the very beginning of this. I got so fed up with national curriculum and testing and teaching and testing that in the end I left Wythenshawe, and I became the founding CEO of a children's university, which was about children learning out of school. Then became the global education director for Kidzania, which was also about children experiencing the environment as the third teacher out of school, and then worked with universities to do evaluations, and then started advising companies and businesses, and now do that globally. What came out of that was that parents, carers, taking an interest in their children and spending time with them and learning with them
is fundamental,
is key. And why, and part of the children's university work was to get parents to accompany children to museums, galleries, sports clubs, farms, restaurants. Yeah, I remember we had one of our learning destinations was a restaurant group in Bradford called Mumtaz. And whenever you turned up there as a family, the children would get the stamp in their learning passport because there were exercises in the restaurant that were about India and that were about the food and why certain food was in a certain way. And the kids would go away and they'd speak half a sentence of Urdu or whatever it was.
Right.
That's the educator role. So leave the schooling to the teachers, but be there to educate you and have a laugh and enjoy it, right? Why not? And also the other thing is, we won't get it right all the time, and it won't be enjoyable all the time. And I'll give you an example from Kidzania, London. There was a boy, he was 8 years old, and he was undertaking the activity of being an estate agent. So he was going around measuring the buildings inside Kidzania, London, and on his iPad making all the notes. And I've rarely in my years in Kidzania, London, seen a child looking more bored than that particular boy. So I used to walk around all the time and talk to the kids and to the teachers and to the parents. So I went up to this little young man and said, "You don't mind me saying so, you look really bored." And he went, "I am." And I said, "Well, so why are you still doing this then?" And his answer was, "What, you mean I can stop?" And I said, "Yeah, you can stop." He said, "But in school, you can't do that." And I said, "Well, this is not schooling. This is education. If you want to stop, you've given me a good enough reason, we have to chat why you want to stop. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And now you've learned that this is something you don't want to do. And you can only learn that by that experience. You have to do me a massive favor. Will you please take all your things back to the estate agent's building inside Kidzania and just hand it back so that the next person can do this?" And he went, "I will, thank you very much." He said, "You do understand you won't get paid for this activity?" And he went, "I don't think that's fair." I said, what is your dad do? He said, "My dad's a plumber." I said, "So he can do half a job and get his money? That's really cool." And he laughed and he said, "No, we can't." I said, "Right, point taken." We need to provide those experiences. We can teach those from a textbook till the cows come home. The impact will never be the same as what experience-based learning gives us. And we as parents need to make that happen because they have to get to places. We need to drive them there. We need to sit down with them. And, people talk about screen time. Screen time is bad for you. I'm not quite sure because it's really convenient that we blame the technology for a human shortcoming. Yeah, because actually, I had this conversation with an audience in Moscow, and this is a group of parents. It's called a large conference, and this father said to me, "When my children come home, the teenagers, all they do is they just go to their room and they're either on their laptop or on their phone or on their TV, and they don't talk to me." So I said to him, "Okay." I said, "Who put the telly in the room?"
Right. In the kid's bedroom?
Yeah.
Right.
And he went, "Well, I did." I said, so it's not the telly's fault, is it really? So do you sometimes knock on the door and go in and ask them what they're watching? Or do you say, "Oh, don't watch it upstairs, come and sit with me, what shall we watch down here?" Right. So again, we're quite good at looking for, so never blame technology, just blame the people behind it and blame ourselves. And so the role of the parent, I would go as far as to say that an engaged, motivated parent is singularly and supportive parent, singularly the most important thing you can give a child.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, and then it doesn't matter whether you are a millionaire or whether you are poor. If I, as the child, feel that you're there for me and you're interested in me and you're proud of me, do you got any idea what it's like? Do you remember what that was like when your parents were proud of you?
Yeah.
You grew, didn't you?
Absolutely. And they took an interest in what you were doing, yeah.
So this is like stating the obvious, and I'm really sad that sometimes it isn't the obvious. And I think sometimes it isn't the obvious because schools also need to work harder at this.
Okay.
This is now not a license for all the parents watching this going, "It's the school's fault," by the way, right? We need to, that's the pebble in the pond bit.
Okay. And Professor, almost, I suppose the penultimate question is, having travelled the world, because you have advised governments literally all over the world on education, which is incredible. I mean, having reflected on such a long career and advised so many governments, you must see the same thing all over the world. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Russia or America or India, it's the same issues are coming up all the time, and what we've been discussing on education, and how important it is for parents to take an interest in the child. Having said all of that, in all your travels and all the meetings you've had, are there any countries or areas or schools that are particularly stand out and are kind of, for you, a benchmark of excellence, a paragon, if you like, of doing it right? Are there any places or countries that you say, wow, if I was to say it's not perfect, but out of all the places I've seen, this is like, a standout?
Yes, there are. So I think it's always a good thing to try and personalize things. So I ask myself the question, wherever I've been, where would I have preferred to send my children? Right? And rather than kind of giving an objective answer. And my conclusion is twofold, really. One is, you can't have the best schooling and education system in the world based on American levels of taxation. That calculator doesn't work.
Right.
So it is a bit like healthcare, I suppose. It is about the values that we attach to these things as a society. And then we need to put our money where our mouth is. And the politicians have a big role to play in that in terms of transparency.
Right.
But I'd like to think if anybody stood up at the next general election, not just in this country, but in many other countries, and said, we are going to put 3 pence in the pound on income tax. And those 3 pence in the pound for the next 5 years are going to go on schooling and education. And we will be really transparent how that money will be spent. Right? Everybody can watch it. It's not going to go into other people's pockets, all that nonsense. I'd be very surprised if that wouldn't be a vote winner. I'd be very sad if it wasn't. And I think when you go to certain countries, like some of the Scandinavian countries, it's very easy to say, look what they're doing. Actually, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, look at the values in their society. And that matters a great deal. Now, I can also take you to very poor parts of India, where there are similar attitudes, because also, and that's a very interesting one, in some of the poorer parts of the world, the schooling and education is seen quite often as the only way up and out.
So there's mega emphasis.
There's an there is a survival purpose. So that's another focus. The thing where would I have wanted to send my children? Mm-hmm. Bearing in mind what we said much earlier, Stefano, about early years, and it starts in building the foundation. I'm sure you'd be delighted, but I would have loved all 3 of my children to be under the care of my very good friend Carlo Rinaldi, who's the president of the Fondazione Reggio Children in Reggio Emilia. Right. I would have loved for them to have been to a school in Reggio Emilia where the environment is the
Reggio Emilia,
yes, and where progress is documented, and where the teacher is the enabler and the empowerer, and where the parents are the co-educators.
Wow.
And which is not perfect, but it's nearer perfect than most other places. And I think all 3 of my children would have really loved it. And I think as a parent, I would have loved it. So that's from a very personal experience.
Professor, it's been an absolute delight to speak to you. If people want to, do you have an Instagram or social media page that people can follow you on? If they want to read and listen to you talk, because you've done a TED talk. Yeah. Is there anything? Can you just rattle out the socials quickly?
So my very, very good friend Mark Sylvester, who was in charge of TEDx in California. Yeah. Mark built me for my birthday.
Right.
Built me a website. And it's www.gergraus.com, and pretty much all articles and all speeches, and including a contact details or email address, are on there. So it's probably the easiest.
And we'll put that on the podcast. We'll make sure that it goes up there. Amazing. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming down to talk to me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.